At about 6:30, Freddie needed to go to the loo, and I walked alongside to steady him. He sat down to have a pee, and I leaned against his shoulder to support him. "You're in the way," he grumbled, and elbowed me painfully. "If I move away from here, you're going to fall over," I insisted. I got him back to bed, where he sat quietly for a while. Then he just looked up to me and said, "You know, there's something I'd love to see." "What is it?" I asked. "I would love to go down and see my pictures," he said. He had no control of his muscles by this time, and he couldn't even place his arms around someone's neck to support himself to be carried. "I'll carry you," I said. "It's not a problem." Freddy sat on the bed for another 5 minutes, summoning up his strength. Then his brown eyes twinkled and he said, "Okay, let's go." He was wearing a Mickey Mouse dressing gown and was barefoot. Although I said I would carry him, he was adamant that he would at least try to walk as far as he could. He supported himself on the banister and stumbled down the staircase. I kept slightly ahead of him, putting my arm out to steady him. He kept pushing my arm away. It was a typical act of defiance. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, Freddie looked around the hallway at some prints Peter had rehung there. He sighed gently, looking at them for a few moments. "Whoa, they look great," he said. Then I led Freddie into the lounge and sat him on the chair. He sat with the newly arrived portrait of the young boy immediately ahead of him in the darkness. One by one, I slowly flicked on the light over each picture, left to right around the room. Finally, I lit up the portrait of the boy. The light fell mostly on his face, then spilled over the boy's clothes. "They're beautiful," said Freddie. But most of all, I was mesmerized by the boy. He let out a succession of small, contented sighs. After 10 minutes, he announced, "Okay, let's go." I carried him back upstairs, and it was a bit of a struggle. As we reached the door, he said, "You know, I never realized you were so strong." "Yes, you did," I said. "I knew from our early nightclub days when I would hurl him around the crowded dance floor." I think he said it as his way of thanking me for looking after him. When I went back downstairs to switch off the lights, I looked around the pictures slowly, soaking them in. I think that Friday morning was the last time I could honestly say Freddie was happy. The last time that Freddie Mercury was still there. The last time he radiated that Freddie Mercury excitement. The rest of that morning, he seemed alert and well aware of what was going on. Jim Beach arrived for a private meeting, and it triggered a flurry of activity to do with Freddie's statements to the press that he was suffering from AIDS. I've always been very doubtful that Freddie made that statement of his own accord. He had kept it all quiet for so long that it seemed odd that he'd suddenly want to start confessing things, as if he had something to be ashamed of. I'm sure he felt his fate should not become a matter for public debate. It was only a matter for him and his immediate friends. And I'm sure he didn't want to risk Joe and me being subjected to the publicity. I did not even know that Freddie was going to issue statements. I believe Freddie was coerced into making the statements. However, once he had been persuaded, I know that Freddie specifically told Jim Beach to release the statement worldwide to prevent the British gutter press from having a scoop to themselves. It was Freddie's way of saying to those so eagerly awaiting his death, "Fuck the lot of you." That Friday, I slipped out for a relaxing drink at the Gate Club in Notting Hill. When I got home, I went straight up to Freddie's room. He was asleep, and Peter was dozing next to him, on the top of the bed covers. He dozed through much of the next day. And in the evening, I went up to see him. We were lying together on the bed when he asked me what time it was. "It's 8 o'clock," I said. Soon the whole world will know, he sighed, looking at me with sad brown eyes. This was the first indication I had that something was going on. When Freddie nodded off, I went downstairs and mentioned what he'd said to Joe and Peter. They confirmed that the statement explaining his condition had been prepared. It was due to be released at midnight. I wasn't supposed to be keeping watch over Freddie through Saturday night, Joe was. But he'd gone out to the gym, then out for a drink, and didn't reappear. It was with Freddie in his room at around 10 when he got terribly agitated. He kept asking me where Joe had got to. Why, what's the problem? I asked. Well, I have to take my medicine, he said. Okay, that's not a problem, I answered. I can give you the pills you want. Which ones are they? He knew exactly which 3 or 4 pills he needed. The painkillers. He had been taking AZT, but had abandoned the treatment along with the rest. Freddie and I chatted away all night. I don't remember what we wittered to each other about, even when Freddie was well. It was all happy, inconsequential stuff. We didn't watch television anymore. We just lay on the bed cuddling until he dozed off. And sometimes so did I. Occasionally, he gave me a quick jab to the ribs to stop me snoring, or a harder one if he needed something. Then he asked me to prepare some fruit for him in the kitchen. I sliced some mango and added a little sorbet to help fight his chronic dehydration. We drifted asleep again. When Freddie next woke me, it was about 3 and he seemed incapable of explaining himself. He couldn't talk properly and kept pointing to his mouth, frowning. Something was terribly wrong. I tried to work out what he wanted, but couldn't. About an hour later, Joe came back home, and I saw I was having problems. As soon as Freddie spotted Joe, he pointed to his mouth. What is it, Freddie? Joe asked. What do you want? I told him this had been going on for half an hour, ever since I had prepared some fruit for Freddie, which he'd then eaten before dozing off. Joe leaned over Freddie and opened his mouth. A piece of mango had lodged at the back of his throat, which he could neither swallow nor bring back up. Joe prized Freddie's jaw open wide and flicked out the offending piece of fruit with his finger. Freddie didn't say anything. Joe and I were fully aware that a healthy Freddie would have been furious with me for not understanding. He snipped some juice, then went back to sleep. I went downstairs for coffee, followed closely by Joe. He was about to apologize for not having turned up for night duty, but I wouldn't let him speak. Don't worry about it, I said. I guess I knew where Joe had got to. It was a very heavy strain to bear. He'd found it all too much that day and had to get away from Garden Lodge to forget about Freddie for a while. Joe went upstairs to Freddie's room and lay next to him on the bed. A few minutes later, I went back, told Joe to get some sleep, and took his place next to Freddie, who was fast asleep. Freddie woke up again at 6 in the morning and uttered what were to be his last 2 words. Pee, pee. He wanted to be helped to the loo. He looked terribly weak, and I had to carry him. As I lowered him back onto the bed, I heard a deafening crack. It sounded like one of Freddie's bones breaking, cracking like the branch of a tree. He screamed out in pain and went into convulsion. I yelled for Joe. I needed him to pin Freddie to the bed to stop him injuring himself. Over the years, Joe had seen Freddie have one anxiety attack after another, and he knew just how to handle him, by pinning him down until the anxiety had passed. He said, Freddie, calm down, Freddie, calm down. Then Freddie's hand shot up and went straight for Joe's throat. He was like a drowning man clutching for air. Joe freed himself from Freddie's grip, and eventually he calmed him down. Then, exhausted by the strain, Freddie promptly fell asleep. We phoned his GP, Dr. Gordon Atkinson, and he came over and gave Freddie an injection of morphine to help him through the day. Joe later told me Freddie was allergic to morphine, but it was now so late in the day it didn't seem to matter. Mary came by later in the morning and we all stood around the kitchen, waiting to hear Dr. Atkinson's prognosis. He said, "Freddie will probably last until Thursday." Joe and I looked at each other. We both knew that there was no way Freddie could last that long. Mary left shortly after that. The rest of that day, Freddie nodded in and out of sleep. Elton John came to visit him one last time, driving himself in his green Bentley. He parked right outside the gate, blocking Logan Road completely. His attitude to the press was, "Stuff you lot. I want to see my friends and I don't care about any of you." He didn't stay very long. I felt the need to get well away from Garden Lodge. So that afternoon I took myself off in the Volvo to Holland Park, where I moped around for an hour. By the time I got back, Freddie was as ill as I'd ever seen him. He seemed to know what was going on around him, but couldn't respond to any of it. He could hear, but couldn't move his eyes to acknowledge he'd heard. He just stared straight ahead, eyes glazed. Dr. Atkinson stayed at the house all afternoon and left just after 6:30. I thanked him for having stayed so long, saw him out, and then went straight back to be with Freddie. All that day Delilah had been in the bedroom, but not once had she sat on the bed. She remained crouched at the foot. Dave Clark was sitting by the bed, massaging Freddie's hands. I picked Delilah up and placed her next to Freddie. Dave then took Freddie's hand and started stroking Delilah's coat with it. "It's Delilah," he told Freddie. He seemed to recognize what he was being told. Freddie made clear he wanted to go to the loo. After the terrible convulsions which had followed his morning visit to the bathroom, he wasn't bold enough to try to cope with him again single-handed. I flew downstairs and found Phoebe. By the time we got back upstairs, Freddie had wet the bed. Dave Clark didn't seem to have noticed. Peter looked over at me and asked, "Shall we change the bedclothes?" "We'd better," I answered. "If we don't, and he wakes up, he'll go absolutely apeshit." I don't know why I said that. Perhaps it was my subconscious trying to make out that things were less serious than they were. Peter started changing the bed while I took care of Freddie. As I was about to change Freddie into a clean t-shirt and a pair of boxer shorts, I asked Dave to leave the room for a few moments. It was when I was getting his shorts on that I felt him try to raise his left leg to help a little. It was the last thing he did. I looked down at him, knowing he was dead. "Phoebe," I cried out. "I'm sorry, he's gone." I slipped my arm under Freddie's neck, kissed him, and then held him. His eyes were still open. I can remember very clearly the expression on his face, and when I got to sleep every night, it's still there in front of me. He looked radiant. One minute he was a boy with a gaunt, sad little face, and the next he was a picture of ecstasy. Freddie's whole face went back to everything it had been before. He looked finally and totally at peace. Seeing him, that made me feel happy in my sadness. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I knew that he was no longer in pain. Dave Clark had only got as far as the doorway when Freddie died. He came back in to stay with me, and Phoebe ran to find Joe. I stopped the tiny flywheel of the wind-up carriage clock by the bed. I'd given it to Freddie because he told me he'd always wanted one. It read 12 minutes to 7. I've never started it again.